provincial Peruvian town of Kasma, 400 kilometers north of Lima. There are archaeological sites equipped for tourists in Casma, but they're not as impressive as the famous monuments of Machu Picchu, Cusco, and therefore there are few tourists here. But for archaeologists and historians, Casma is an important and interesting area. A large number of ruins can be seen on the satellite map, many of which have orthogonal layouts typical of urban construction. It is believed that these are the remains of the Kasma Sashin culture, one of the oldest centers of civilization on Earth. In Kasma, there is the largest building of the pre-Renaissance in South America, Sashin Alto, about 2 kilometers long. Monumental structures dating back to 3600 BC have been found here and were built 1,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramids in Egypt. The most famous tourist site in Casma is the archaeological site of Cerro Sashin, dating back to the 3rd millennium BC. The monument is well preserved as it was buried under an avalanche that descended from the hill. The central rooms are made of mud bricks. The outer wall is made of roughly cut granite stones on clay mortar. The most interesting thing about this monument is the images engraved on the granite blocks. Basically, these are severed heads and figures of warriors or priests. Here you can see images of dismembered bodies, torn out eyes, fragments of the spine, and various internal organs. There are several versions of the purpose of this structure. Until recently, it was assumed that this is a monument dedicated to a victorious war with the neighbors. Now, the most popular version is that this is a temple where many sacrifices were performed. But there is also a very unusual version. This is an ancient medical and ritual surgical center. There are no images of battle scenes, no gods in whose honor sacrifices were made, but there are carefully cut off heads, arms and legs, dismembered bodies, a cleansed spine, organs of the gastrointestinal tract, some of which are depicted with amazing anatomical precision. There is even an image of a head with an open skull and possibly brain manipulation. And on large and tall blocks located in the form of steles on both sides of the entrance, there are engraved objects that historians consider to be ritual standards. But some researchers see them as surgical saws. Despite this mystery, the ritual and administrative purpose of the object does not raise any questions. But in Casma there are strange structures, the purpose of which remains unclear. Everyone is well aware of the Nazca geoglyphs, huge geometric shapes, lines, and stripes inscribed on the surface of the desert. But few people know that Casma also has such gigantic structures, although there are more than 700 kilometers from here to Nazca. There are much fewer of them here than in Nazca. The total length of the lines found is several tens of kilometers. These are stripes with visible boundaries 40 to 50 meters wide, clearly visible on satellite maps. There is no doubt about the age of all these lines. They are often significantly damaged by streams that dried up in antiquity. At first glance, they look like ordinary roads, but this is not the case. Sometimes the stripes abut against mountain slopes without any continuation or disappear in desert places, and usually they are not associated with any archaeological sites. Not far from Kasma, there is an area where intersections of almost perfectly straight lines are visible. It is clearly seen that some of the stripes run into the mountains without a visible continuation. Unfortunately, now the site is being prepared for mango gardens, and there is particularly nothing left of the lines. Several kilometers to the east, there are line fragments that are much better preserved. In aerial photography, a line is clearly visible, which rests against the gorge with a difficult relief, the riverbeds that it crosses, and the connection of the two lines. Nowadays, these lines are used as roads as they have much less stones compared to the surrounding desert. In the valley, the lines stretch for 7 kilometers, again merge into one, which in turn seems to dissolve in the desert without any visible continuation. These lines can really be called structures. Usually their edges are simple mounds of stones, but some sections of the boundaries are made of 2 rows of buried stones with filling between them. The connection of lines is done more carefully. We see something similar to a stone bump, curbs, a safety island, as is done on modern roads. The line connections at the opposite end of the valley are made in the same way. Strange stone structures with pottery fragments are often found within and around the lines. Perhaps these are traces of ancient rituals. Now, we're a few kilometers north of the place we just flew over, and we're exactly in the middle of the strip. Obviously, these lines were not built as roads. The borders of the line run along the slopes of the ravine, and there are traces of the ancient path along which it would be comfortable to move. The inner space of the lines was often not free of large stones, and if it was not for the modern road, it would be difficult to go through here. There is also intensive work going on to create the gardens, but the ancient line, because of the massive borders, has not yet been touched. Perhaps this will save it for a while in the future. The width of the borders in some areas is quite impressive. For example, here it reaches 4 meters. But the ancient structures are powerless against the modern construction equipment. Near the highway, the borders and the ancient lines have been completely destroyed. We're now moving towards the archaeological area of Pampa de Lamas. Several years ago, there were also ancient lines here. This can be seen on satellite maps, but unfortunately, not a trace of them remained. Now, there are mango gardens here. The archaeological complex of Pampa de Lamas is the ruins of a large ancient city, possibly even the capital of a proto-state formation in the Casma Valley. According to the archaeologist, the ruins are about 4,000 years old. 2 large bas-reliefs were found here, which are in the Cerro Sechín Museum. We see the remains of a large pyramid structure surrounded by wide squares and many ruins of small structures. The city has a pronounced orthogonal layout, and it may have been conceived as a single whole. This planning and execution is so precise that the facades of the longest row of mounds along the western side diverge only 30 centimeters from the straight line at a distance of more than 700 meters, even after 4,000 years of exposure to the elements. But what we see from the air is not the whole story. The center was a little further south and is buried under modern farmland. Nowadays, you can only see the ruins of a maheke, the central pyramid-shaped structure. According to archaeologists, the ruins are about 4,000 years old. Crossing the whole city and the valley, there is a line obliquely built in a way which we are already familiar with. Its beginning is well preserved. It is not a road, it is not an irrigation canal, and begins from an almost empty spot at the bases of small mountains. The beginning of the strip is a pile of stones, and in the city itself, the line has well-defined boundaries. The strip runs straight over the ruins as if a giant hand has drawn a line across the valley. The line is about 15 meters wide and over 2 kilometers long. The end of the line dissolves into a desert area without visible destinations to any objects. Part of the borders are made in the form of a stone mound, but most of the borders are very high quality. These are again 2 rows of large stones with filling between them. As well as on all previous lines, fragments of ancient ceramics are encountered here. It is not known whether these ceramics were ritual or just garbage left over from residents and builders. What was the point of building this almost perfectly straight structure? Was a line built through the city in which they still lived, or did the ancient builders cross already left ruins? And why were there tens of kilometers of all other lines built? They did not pass through the settlements and did not connect any significant objects. Why spend a huge amount of labor for the construction of such structures which are illogical from a modern point of view? As we have seen, these are not roads or irrigation canals. Maybe these are signs for ancient pilgrims pointing to holy places. But why are they so enormous with such capitally constructed borders clearly visible from a great height? Maybe these are special directions for the heavenly gods who were worshipped by the ancients. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about the people who lived here. What language they spoke, what their worldview was, social structure, what gods they worshipped. There's practically no archaeological work being carried out here, and we will not soon find out the answer. Six kilometers south of Pampa de Lamas, in an ancient city cut by a mysterious line, there's another interesting archaeological site, the Chanquillo fortified temple. But before we climb up the hill and carefully examine this amazing structure, it is necessary to say a few words about the monument, 13 towers, located in the immediate vicinity of the temple fortress. On the crest of a small granite hill, there are 13 towers from 2 to 7 meters high. The distance between them is about 5 meters. Date of construction the middle of the first millennium BC. In the year 2000, archaeologists made the assumption that this is an ancient astronomical observatory. A point was found at the end of a long corridor in the nearest ruins, from which the two outer towers indicated the sunrise on the summer and winter solstices. There is a large number of articles and films where archaeologists talk about their discovery. Upon closer inspection, one can find that the towers are tied exclusively to the relief. Their design and the gaps between the towers are not oriented towards the observation point. And the observation point itself is not distinguished by anything special. In Kasma Valley, the ancients knew about the days and the solstices, and many structures are oriented towards these astronomical events. For example, the Sichin Alto monumental complex is focused on the two astronomical events at once: the sunset of the June day and the sunrise of the December solstice, which are on the same line as this geographic zone. The complex Las Aldas, located 20 kilometers to the south, is oriented along a line perpendicular to the direction of these two astronomical events. It is possible that the 13 towers are indeed the oldest astronomical observatory in South America, but it is possible that these are just pedestals that VIPs climb during the holidays. Much more interesting is the object which is less popular and which is considered to be the part of this ancient observatory. So, the Chanquillo Forest Temple. The beginning of construction dates back to 600 BC. The structure was built on a granite hill on a difficult terrain. The object is called a forest because it has massive walls which look like modern defensive structures, and also because during the archaeological excavations, ceramic figures of warriors were found on the territory of the monument. A temple is usually what all objects of unknown purpose are called, especially since there are no traces of any permanent residence here, and it is quite remote from residential buildings. But the most amazing, most mysterious feature of the object is its unusual contours, its appearance visible only from great heights. Nothing like this was built neither before nor after the construction of the Chanquillo temple in the pre-Incas era. The relief is very rugged here. The outer eastern wall is tens of meters lower than the central buildings. But this did not prevent the builders from creating such perfectly calibrated and precisely matched outlines of the structure. Obviously, the facility the size of 8 football fields was built according to a single project. The northern walls are the arcs of concentric circles, and from the south there are perfectly executed curves composed of 4 arcs of concentric circles of different radii. The orientation of the object is amazing. Its inner rectangular room is oriented to the line connecting the winter and summer solstices. The western walls are built perpendicular to this direction, and the eastern walls are oriented exactly in the north-south direction. It should be noted that the ruins and remains of huge areas in this part of the valley are also oriented along the line connecting the winter and summer solstices. The military use raises many questions. Although the walls are massive, they are not high. The outer wall has 5 entrances. There are no sources and reservoirs of water in the structure, and also there are particularly no traces of overlapping of internal buildings. In the hot Peruvian climate, the defenders of the fortress could not hold the line for any significant time. There is a higher section of the hill next to the Chanquillo, which makes the strategic value of the structure even less. It is unlikely that such an object was used for military purposes. The walls are made of granite rubble. The passages in the walls have well-preserved ceilings made of trees, which grow in abundance in the valley. Sometimes there are traces of plaster. It is believed that the temple was completely plastered and painted yellow and white. As archaeologists tell us, the structure was abandoned in antiquity, deliberately destroyed and walled up. The builders stuck to certain technologies. Apparently, at first, external, relatively narrow walls were built, then the voids were filled with stones. This is how the outer walls were built. And this is the inner, artificially raised section of the structure, where the thoroughness and precision of construction becomes visible. A smooth rounding of the outer wall turning into a perfect straight line. The passages in the outer two walls are built in the form of locks, which is completely uncharacteristic for the structures of that era. When you enter, you do not see where the passage leads and what is happening inside. The diagram shows how the gateways are arranged in the outer perimeters. Most likely this was done so that the initiated under no circumstances could look inside. Now we are walking along such a passage. To find yourself in the inner space, you need to make at least 2 turns along a narrow corridor. Due to the peculiarities of the relief, some of the walls of the passages have sections of 8 meters high. Here you can clearly see the mats with which the different layers of masonry were laid, as well as traces of how the outer passages were walled up. There are very unusual structures inside the third perimeter. These are 2 round towers built according to the same scheme, but slightly deployed relative to each other. The diameter of the outer wall of the towers is 40 meters, the inner one is 20. Each has 5 entrance sluices, 3 in the outer wall, 2 in the inner one. To get to the very center, you have to walk an intricate path. The towers are very badly destroyed, but in each one there are remains of niches and pedestals. Next to the towers we see a rectangular structure, the only building in the traditional style similar to a temple of a rich person's residence. Archaeologists call it the Temple of the Pillars after the remains of the pillars found here. The interiors have plaster floors, traces of plaster, and partial ceilings. Remains of stucco molding and ornaments have been preserved on the pillars. A large fragment of the ornament was found inside one of the rooms. But these tracers are very few, since in ancient times the building was deliberately and meticulously destroyed. Based on the materials from a drone, a photogrammetric 3D model was created in which it is easy to see the inner details of this structure. Many of these small structures resemble plinths or pedestals. They are usually round. It is hard to say what they're used for. Perhaps statues were erected on them, bonfires were made, or guards were stationed. Each of the 5 external entrances has a similar circular pedestal. Next to the Temple of the Pillars, there is an unusual stepped pedestal with graceful rounded contours. It was definitely important if it was built in such an inconvenient place. The pedestal blocks almost of the entire passage between the Temple of the Pillars and the wall. And one more interesting feature. In this area, ridges of dark brown rock run along the rolling hills, which are clearly visible against the background of light granite. This brown loose rock is magnetic. On satellite maps and on aerial photography, it is clearly visible that the object is built on the conjunction of 2 such ridges. One of them goes exactly through the centers of the round towers. This ridge is clearly visible between the towers themselves. Perhaps this is a coincidence and has nothing to do with Chanquillo. But it is possible that these geological features were important for ancient architects. During the construction, they saw this, but they placed the centers of the towers exactly on the same ridge. What was the purpose of this object? Why did the ancient builders put so much effort to get graceful, perfectly calibrated, and such unusual outlines of this difficult terrain visible only from a great height? Why is it so precisely oriented? Spatial modeling made it possible to estimate the errors that had to be taken into account when applying the finished plan to the relief. Estimates are very, very approximate. Somewhere builders were helped by an eye, somewhere by experience and methods of measurement, but somewhere, on the contrary, additional difficulties arose due to the relief, which is smoothed out on the 3D model. In general, when drawing complex concentric curves, the builders took into account these differences in distances and applied to the terrain a contour that has no noticeable distortions, which we now see on the coordinate grid. In the end, the resulting orthographic projection looks flawless. How the ancient builders did this without any precise measuring instruments or with some sort of control from a height remains a mystery. Being inside the object or nearby, you cannot even imagine that the structure has such amazing contours. But what or for whom were the 2 identical towers built? Did they contain artifacts, or did they contain people, oracles, healers? Chankillo was a very important and significant place for the ancients. The desert in front of the hill is literally strewn with fragments of pottery. What rituals or ceremonies were carried out here? According to historians, the system of beliefs was shamanism, which is significantly different from the modern, largely formal religion. Or maybe something was happening here that is beyond our understanding. We can only hope that new ways of studying and modern technology will help us unravel the exciting mystery of the Chanquillo temple forests. In the 20th century, on the eastern outskirts of Lima, geoglyphs were discovered from an airplane, a large number of stripes and figures. They are called the Canto Grande geoglyphs, after the name of the ancient culture that existed here about 4,500 years ago. Unfortunately, due to intensive urban construction in our time, almost nothing is left of them. Several kilometers higher along the gorge where civilization has not yet reached, several similar geoglyphs were found on satellite maps. In the mountains on the small flat area of the surface, there is a giant drawing, which apparently belongs to the Canto Grande group of geoglyphs. But the most amazing thing that in form, construction method, and location, it is very similar to the well-known Nazca lines. Most of the Nazca geoglyphs are trapezoids, truncated triangles, from a narrow part of which thin lines emerge at different angles. The geoglyph that we see is also a trapezoid, with lines extending from the narrow end. The geoglyph is about 150 meters long. It was built in the same way as Nazca geoglyphs were mainly built. The surface inside the contour was cleared of stones which were transferred to the curbs. On the Nazca Plateau, on the wide part of many trapezoids, there is a single element in the form of a single stone, a group of large stones, a heap of rubble, or a ring structure. Here, on the wide part, there is also a single element. It is a ring structure of stones, where you can see fragments of ancient ceramics. Like most Nazca trapezoids, this trapezoid, with its wide part, is directed towards the valley, to a lower and open space. Literally 1.5 kilometers from the trapezoid, there is another unique geoglyph, which no longer resembles the Nazcan figures. It is a perfect circle with a diameter of 135 meters with a straight line adjacent to it. The geoglyph is located on the top of a mountain, on a slope. The builders put a lot of effort to clear the 7-mile strip. Some stones weigh tens or even hundreds of kilograms. What is the point of building these structures in such hard-to-reach places? There is not even a hint of any ancient roads or large settlements. And how did the drawing, in many ways repeating the Nazcan geoglyphs, turn out to be 400 kilometers from Nazca? Furthermore, if you take into account the age of the culture that is credited with creating these geoglyphs, it was built 2,000 years before the appearance of the Nazca culture. It is a pity that research on these interesting structures is practically not carried out. Looking at these ruins, you might think that these are the remains of an ancient city, of which there are quite a lot in Peru. But it's not. Before us is one of the most mysterious ancient structures which still baffles historians and archaeologists. But first things first. Pikillacta was built during the Huari culture. The beginning of construction of Pikillacta is 500 to 600 AD. Huari is a little studied, largely mysterious culture that existed on the west coast of Peru from 500 to 1100 AD. Many historians consider it the first empire in South America. The influence of the Huari spread rapidly to almost the entire territory of modern Peru between 500 and 600 AD. The empire had such great power and wealth that it allowed Huari not only to maintain expansion with a large bureaucracy and armies, but also to build large administrative centers throughout the territory. Pikillacta is located at an altitude of 3,200 meters, just 200 kilometers from Cusco, the ancient capital of the Incas. The original name of the monument is unknown. It was first called Piquillacta during the time of the Incas, who came here a few hundred years after the disappearance of Huari. Translated from Quechua, language of the Incas, Pikillacta means flea city. Indeed, walking along these long and straight as narrow, stretching for hundreds of meters roads, avenues, looking at the labyrinths of monumental ruins, you begin to feel like something very small and insignificant. However, to truly appreciate the grandeur of this unique and one-of-a-kind building, you can only look at it from a great height. The outlines of the structure, despite the different terrain, where the height difference reaches 100 meters, look perfect. Its dimensions are amazing, 750 by 630 meters. What we see here is not a group of separate structures interconnected. Pikillacta was built in the form of a single building, and it was done according to a carefully detailed and thought-out plan. Pikillacta has about 30 kilometers of walls and 100 separate rooms. The amount of labor and materials involved is comparable to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt. These walls and structures are the centerpiece of an unfinished complex covering an area of about 2 square kilometers. But this is only the visible part of a larger structure. A kilometer to the east is the famous monument of Rumicolca, built under the rule of Huari. A few centuries after the departure of the Huari, the Incas rebuilt it into an outpost, since the road that runs along the gorge here led to their capital, Cusco. Under the Huari, the Rumicolca was an aqueduct supplying water to Pikillacta. Even before the start of the construction, a complex system of hydraulic structures was designed and built, consisting of underground and surface channels, aqueducts, and reservoirs stretching for more than 50 kilometers high into the mountains. A correctly calculated slope provided a flow of water with such a speed as not to destroy the channels themselves and at the same time avoiding losses in the water's filtration through the bottom. A system of reservoirs balanced out the amount of water during the rainy season. Pikillacta was first explored in the 1930s. Before that, huaqueros, grave robbers, were the ones engaged in activities here. From the middle of the 20th century, the monument began to be intensively studied, and an archaeological mission is working here to this day. There are 4 sectors in the diagram. Sector 1 consists of 80 huge cell courtyards with walls 40 meters long and fenced with a system of gallery corridors. Central Sector 2, believed to be administrative, is of extremely complex construction. Sector 3 also consisted of rectangular courtyard structures, the size of which was larger than the first sector. This sector has been hit hard. Until recently, a village was located here which is now demolished. The first studies and restoration attempts were unsuccessful. The documents were lost, and the archaeologists who worked here, instead of rectangular structures, began to mistakenly recreate terraces by analogy with Inca buildings. Sector 4, about 500 small separate premise rooms. This is a very interesting part of the complex, and we'll look at it later. It is noteworthy that Huari used a metric system similar to the modern one. Their buildings are multiples of 1, 2, 5, 10, or more meters. It is believed that the complex was functional. There are even traces of repair and restoration. But several yards in sectors 1 and 3 remained unfinished. The walls are thickly plastered and painted. The rooms have massive floors made of clay and gypsum. The height of the walls reaches 14 meters. There are cornices in the walls, and it is believed that many structures were 2 to 3 story buildings which had roofs. The yards themselves remained in the open. There is a special type of premises called Temple of Niches, small rooms with rounded corners and trapezoidal niches in the walls. In the corners of these rooms, there are equipped pits of offerings. According to archaeologists, construction began with external and common walls for all sectors. When applying a plan of this size on uneven terrain, errors will inevitably arise in which the general contours are significantly distorted. But from above, Pikillacta looks like it was applied on a flat plane. There are no clues as to how the Huari architects managed to achieve this. And a natural question arises. What was the purpose of Pikillacta? For what purpose did Huari spend so many resources? It is quite obvious that for the construction of such a scale, the efforts of many thousands of people, architects, craftsmen, and the resources of almost the entire empire are needed. Archaeologists are able to accurately determine the purpose of ancient objects by archaeological artifacts, burials, logic, and style of architecture. But this is just where the unsolvable mysteries associated with Pikillacta begin. As it turned out, there are practically no archaeological artifacts in the Pikillacta that can be found on the surface of the earth. 500 years after the construction and operation began, the Huari people carefully cleaned and unburied Pikillacta when they left here in about 1100. A very small number of fragments of ceramics, burnt bones, and bronze miniatures are found by archaeologists under the floors, deep in the earth. It is believed that these are ritual offerings, but it is possible that many of the finds are household garbage that the builders left behind. Several skulls and fragments of human bodies were found, and only 4 skeletons, 2 of which are embedded in the wall at the beginning of the construction. That is, the number of finds associated with activities in Pikillacta is quite insignificant. But the most mysterious and intriguing thing that baffles modern archaeologists is that there are extremely few doorways and almost no windows in Pikillacta. All sectors are isolated from each other, and avenues in the first 3 sectors have access only to some neighboring structures. In our time, it is no longer possible to understand what individual structures looked like, what was their height, whether there were roofs, exterior finishes, but the 3-dimensional reconstruction that we now see accurately reflects the scale of the entire structure and its detailed plan. In closed rooms and corridors inside courtyards, there are sometimes doorways, but, most surprisingly, the courtyards do not communicate with each other in any way. That is, almost all courtyards in the first 3 sectors are completely isolated from each other and have no connection with adjacent structures. How the movement between courtyards surrounded by high walls took place remains a mystery. It is also unclear how the interior rooms were illuminated. There are no traces of soot on the walls. Another riddle is the 4th sector. These are about 500 absolutely identical small rooms, 4 by 5 meters in size, with entrances and rounded corners. This sector is separated by perhaps the thickest and most powerful wall that can be seen in Pikillacta. It can be clearly seen that the rooms themselves narrow slightly in height. It is difficult to say whether they had roofs, but without roofs it would be uncomfortable here. The rainy season is quite long and the temperature at night can almost drop to almost 0. There are also no archaeological artifacts here that would help to understand the purpose of these premises. Archaeologists occasionally find only debris and traces of hearts left after Pikillacta was abandoned. Interestingly, the backs of all rooms are additionally reinforced with very thick walls. When you pass by the rows of these identical rooms, a completely natural analogy arises with the rows of booth offices in a modern business center or with a production line where certain products are mass-produced. These rooms were given a special significance since rounded corners are usually seen in Huari temple buildings. It is completely incomprehensible why Huari needed so many identical rooms organized into a huge, well-ordered structure. There's another mysterious building in Pikillacta. Now we're moving along the road by which tourists usually arrive in Pikillacta. The same road was used in antiquity. It is clearly visible on the satellite map. But there is a second road that leads to nowhere. The road, 10 meters wide, with 10-meter walls in the form of a fence, starts from the 4th sector and passes through the mountains. The road goes directly on the rocks, which makes it very difficult to pass, although the builders were quite capable of removing. Further, the road runs along a very steep slope, where one edge is much higher than the other, passes over the top and dissolves on an even steeper slope. It was not possible to go down there because of the steepness of the slope and an unthinkable amount of thorny plants covering everything around. If you drive around the monument on a modern highway, you will find that the place where the road comes out to is completely impassable. There are rocks and a steep climb. That is a road more than 600 meters long, was made either purely formally or had completely incomprehensible functions. What is the purpose of Pikillacta? For Huari, this was a paramount project. The construction of such an object requires the efforts of the entire empire. It is significant that Huari had a capital near the modern city of Ayacucho. It was a large city by ancient standards, where there are living quarters, temples, roads, warehouses for products. A large number of archaeological artifacts are still found here, but there is no regular planning, as in Pikillacta. There is none in other settlements either. There are only a few sites on the territory of the Huari Empire that have a similar rectangular architecture. There's only one building similar in scale and architecture to Pikillacta. Just like Pikillacta, it is located on the outskirts of the empire in the town Viracochapampa. It is slightly smaller and only the central part has been built, but elements of Pikillacta architecture are clearly visible here as well. Until recently, it was believed that Pikillacta is a major administrative and ceremonial center of the Huari culture. More recently, a large settlement of Huari was found 15 kilometers away, which has traces of residential and temple buildings, as well as a large number of archaeological remains, and which is considered the real administrative center. At the same time, Pikillacta, as can be seen from the unusual architecture and almost complete absence of artifacts, was not used for housing or any active ceremonial activity. Unlikely are the versions of warehouses for food or military barracks for the same reasons. There are hypotheses that this is a terrible prison for especially dangerous criminals, or a warehouse of tribal relics and mummies of tribes subordinate to Huari. But even in these cases, there must be both archaeological artifacts and some logic in the architecture. But what is the logic behind the roads leading to nowhere and completely isolated courtyards surrounded by multi-story galleries? In this intricately accurate rectilinear architecture, what did the builders hope to achieve putting in this incredible effort? How was this complex built? How was it designed? The builders, especially those who supervise simple performers, should have had a plan for the entire structure. But during the Huari culture, there was only a quipu, a primitive knot writing. Interestingly, the Incas were well aware of the Pikillacta and, as we have seen, restored their aqueduct, but there is no evidence of the presence in Pikillacta itself. Perhaps it was a cursed place, or for some other reason the Incas avoided Pikillacta. This unique monument is very popular among tourists. Archaeological research is constantly being carried out here. Restoration work is underway, but there are still no acceptable versions of the purpose of this object.